The United States Supreme Court just came out with a ruling that will change every election for the rest of your life. This is what they ruled. They said that racial gerrymandering is completely illegal, and the Democrats have been doing this for years. In fact, if you look at this map, this case called the Louisiana versus Callis case, it did not strike down a certain section of the Voting Rights Act that talks about gerrymandering. It struck down and ruled unconstitutional the practice that the Democrats, specifically in this case in Louisiana, were doing to unconstitutionally draw majority black congressional districts based solely on race. When you look at this map, this is egregious. This was a slam dunk, by the way. There was a predominant majority, and I'm going to go over the particulars. But looking at the setup here, I'm going to show you not only the particulars, but now also show you why this changes everything for the midterms in just 12 months and every single election that we're going to go through going forward. So this case, again, was based on a Louisiana congressional map, which added a second majority black district to comply with a lower court's Voting Rules Act, or Voting Rules Act ruling. It was ruled, though, to be totally unconstitutional because, again, it was based singularly on race. This was a 6-3 decision. It was led by Justice Alito and joined by Roberts, Thomas, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson, of course they dissented. They always do. There's not been a ruling based on law that they haven't dissented on. They're just progressive liberals that are doing everything they can to go against the logic of the Constitution. Justice Alito's opinion, though, gives us all of the details that we need to pay attention to. He says this: because the Voting Rights Act did not require Louisiana to create an additional majority-minority district, no compelling interest justified the state's use of race in creating a special district number 8 in this case. And the map that they used is unconstitutional and racially gerrymandering. Section 2, and this is the critical part that the progressives are going to, of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, it was designed to enforce the Constitution, not to collide with it. And unfortunately, lower courts have sometimes applied this court's Section 2 precedent in a way that forces states to engage in the very race-based discrimination that the Constitution actually forbids. As Alito says, the state's attempt to satisfy the Middle District's ruling, although understandable, it was unconstitutional and it was racial gerrymandering. So what does this mean ultimately? Again, I want to start with this. Keep this in mind. This was the map that the Louisiana Democrats were trying to do. And again, they were trying to create another zone here that was only based on race. That's what this ruling was all about. But let's get over to CNN because they actually, in this case, are quite honest with what's going to happen with every single election, including the midterms going forward.
It could have an impact on the midterms and beyond here, Jeff.
There's no doubt about it. And early voting, to Joan's point, does begin on Saturday in Louisiana. This Saturday, the overseas ballots have already been shipped out. So that explains the timing here. And I think it's important to look at this in a couple different ways, the short-term effect and the long-term effect. And Joan is absolutely right. There is no doubt in years beyond, this is going to majorly change representation largely across the South and elsewhere. Likely opening the door for more Republican seats, certainly in southern states. But even before we get to that, in Florida, as the opinion was being read, as Justice Kagan was reading her dissent from the bench and as Justice Alito was reading his majority opinion, the Florida House of Representatives at that very hour passed the new Florida maps. Now they have to go to the Florida State Senate. But this ruling likely makes legal challenges to the Florida action much more difficult. And just to remind our viewers, Florida, of course, is redrawing some of its maps to give Republicans 4 more seats. That comes after Democrats in Virginia had a statewide referendum that would likely give Democrats 4 more seats. It's really the culmination of a year-long gerrymandering war. But this ruling is going to change in 2028 and in years beyond, making it more difficult to challenge the drawing of this map. But again, unclear about the actual effects in the midterm elections because some states have already had their primaries. Candidate filing deadlines have already passed, so it's possible.
I'm going to jump in here, but then they conclude here with a good point, so I'm going to play the rest. But keep in mind that the Democrats have done this for decades, where they have tried to go to lower courts to say that the Republican gerrymandering map is racist, right? That's how they were trying to stop every single attempt by state legislatures to remap. They said it was based on race. Well, the irony of all ironies is that's exactly what the Democrats got caught doing in Louisiana. So again, the kettle was calling the pot black while they were doing this the whole time. So they didn't like it when there was, and keep in mind, this is an important point, gerrymandering a map is not illegal. Doing it on the characteristics of race is. That's what this ruling was on. So the Democrats always jumped over the chasm, accusing the Republicans of race-based gerrymandering when that's what they were doing. I don't want you to lose that because he mentioned this here, but then moved past it pretty quickly.
Possible that some states will call a special session of a legislature and try and change maps or postpone elections like Louisiana. We will see. We have to see how that plays out. But I think the bigger impact of this is in the years to come. And Pam, I'm thinking back right now to 13 years ago when Congressman John Lewis was standing in his office watching as the first pillar of the Voting Rights Act was struck down. He said he was sad and dismayed for that. Now, of course, this is sort of a full circle, a major moment in American history, I think, for the dilution of the Voting Rights Act. And we will see the actual impacts going forward. But again, short-term versus long-term, likely not major impacts in the midterm races, but they've already been upended by so much mid-decade redistricting already.
Yeah, and you're right. You mentioned the Shelby case the Supreme Court had, and you know, in that case, they made it so that the southern states no longer have to go for federal review if they make changes to their election laws. And this was all rooted in a history of discriminating against black voters, right? That is why the Voting Rights Act was put into place in the first place, and why critics are saying that this decision further erodes the Voting Rights Act. Thank you so much, Jeff Zeleny.
So again, the talking points for the progressives isn't going to change. They're going to continue saying every time you touch a map, including the previous maps, are all race-based. That's what they were doing, though, and that's the point. So when you look at the potential swing, this is a better view of the map that you saw on the bottom of the previous screen. There's a potential for Democrats to lose 24, well, there's 24 seats potentially held by Democrats, and the potential with this ruling is that these maps now could show a 12-seat swing to the GOP. This is a critical move. And what I've actually just read an Axios article, which is, again, a progressive liberal magazine, that said this could potentially be as high as a 27-seat swing to the Republicans' advantage. So what does that say? In my mind, you need to look past the headline and say that the Democrats potentially for years have artificially and illegally held up to 27 seats that were based on race-based gerrymandering. If that's how many Axios says are at risk when you go and apply the law without race-based gerrymandering, then I would go further and say that that's how many they were illegally holding this whole time. Think about that. 27 seats. That's significant. So Senator Mike Lee puts a real good bow on this. And what he says here is that the U.S. Constitution, again, doesn't prohibit gerrymandering. It does prohibit racial gerrymandering. That's the essence of this case that the Supreme Court just ruled on. Where this goes from here, there's no question that there's going to be an impact in the midterms, but the larger impact for the 28 race and every single race in our lifetimes going forward is going to be affected by this ruling. That's how big it is. And I would say that this case going backwards for every recent major or midterm election has been impacted because Axios admits it. 27 seats potentially could swing or are at debate when using a racial-based gerrymandering lens. That's how many seats the Democrats took while they were crying race the whole time. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Did I miss anything? Let me know in the comments, and you're not going to want to miss the next story. That's where we break all of the details on the James Comey second indictment. You're not going to want to miss it. That story's coming up next. Have a look.